Yeah.
customer service are all wanting the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so you guys recognize there's a huge diversity of thought in this particular room, right? And the huge diversity in what you guys are trying to accomplish in this. And so what I'm going to do just really briefly is I'm going to kind of talk to you about like what this talks about and what it's not about. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where it came from and kind of what my intent is here. So first of all, just a little bit about me. I'll forward to my interest slide in case anybody wants to follow up with a question afterwards. So I grew up in financial services, right? So I've done mostly software throughout my career. About 8 years ago, I started a company called Leading Agile to basically focus on the problem of Agile transformation and helping organizations figure out how to do Agile at scale and become the kinds of organizations that can actually do Agile at scale. And through that work, we get a lot of calls periodically that say, hey, I'm a fast food chain, right? Just for the example here, I'm a fast food chain and I want to apply Agile into new product development. Or I'm a hotel chain and we're going through a major rebranding effort and I'm trying to figure out how to apply Agile into that. And so what this talk really started off as, and the first and only time I've delivered it live was at Agile 2017 last year. Down in Orlando. It was received pretty well, but this talk isn't me sitting up here going, I am an absolute expert in this, and this is exactly how you do it. What this is a talk about really is how I have helped a couple of different companies try to take these concepts from Agile and figure out how to apply them in their context. And so I approach this talk with a lot more humility than I do in a lot of things, because if you guys have ever seen me do a talk on Agile transformation, I kind of think I've got that figured out. Right? This talk's a little bit more of a hypothesis and a little bit more about like ideas to share and ways of thinking about things. And so the way that I kind of structured it, it's a lot of just, are we thinking about the problem the right way? And are we applying these ideas in the right context rather than this is how you use Agile to run your food truck? Right? This isn't the application of Scrum into a marketing or an accounting department. Right? That's not what I'm trying to talk about. What I'm really trying to talk about is when we're dealing with big problems, real constraints, real life timelines, right? How do I deliver those kinds of things with greater business agility? Right? That's the idea that I want to explore. So what we're going to do is we're probably going to spend the first 2/3 of the talk just kind of level setting on concepts. And then towards the end of the talk, I've got 2 slides that we're going to spend some time on that represent the pattern from the fast food place and the pattern from the hotel. And we'll talk about how we help them become a little bit more agile along the way. You guys bought in? Anybody need a minute to like take off and go find another talk? You guys good? Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, you get feedback, and one of the things I've learned is like a lot of times I don't listen to the feedback and go, oh, I really need to change my talk. What I really need to do is make sure that people are in the talk for the right reasons and they understand like what's going on. So you don't want to sit here and be here for the wrong reasons. So anyway, so I can't actually see my slides from the angle that I'm at. So I'm just going to kind of wing it a little bit and try to look around to see where I'm at. So like I said, the first thing we're going to try to do is we're going to explore the problem, and I'm going to see if it resonates with you. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approached solving the problem, and then kind of walk through those case studies that I mentioned to you, and just see if it resonates with you guys. So here's the setup. So I'm actually going to speak from behind the podium because this is actually really kind of tough to see. Oh, did I disappear? Okay, cool. Do you guys mind if I come off the stage? Would that bother you? Is that going to bother you, Tim? It's probably going to bother you, Tim. Tim's recording me. Okay, so so anyway, so client number 1, so we get this call from a company that says, hey, we're a major hotel chain, we're going through a major rebranding effort, we're basically putting new case goods into our hotels, we're changing the colors in the lobby, we're going through a total rebranding effort, and we want you to come in and run a 2-day class on Scrum. Is that not funny to anybody in here? I mean, because that was actually a joke if you guys, okay. So it's just like, you're just not going to apply Scrum into that context. And so what I said is okay, well, let's just come out and let's just talk and let's unpack it a little bit and let's see if there's anything that we can do here, right? So the second one was kind of similar. It's a fast food company, and they're basically like, hey, we do software, right? And we're doing Agile for software pretty well. But we would like to figure out if we could use Agile to figure out how to optimize our supply chain. We want to figure out if we can use Agile to develop more efficient kitchen cooking things, right? Because some of their problems were it was taking years and years and years in product development to try to figure out how to do this, and they needed to go faster. And if you think about it, right, everybody says, okay, Agile helps you go faster. The question is like, how does it help you go faster? Why does it help you go faster? Is it the right applicable thing here, right? So they want to do Agile. They think Agile is going to solve their problem. But more specifically, what we get the ask for a lot is Scrum. And will Scrum help me solve my problem? So we're going to unpack that a little bit here. When I was building this talk, if anybody heard Alistair Coburn? If you guys haven't read any Alistair Coburn stuff and you're interested in Agile, it's like he's one of the signers of the manifesto, still out there teaching and things like that. Really, really smart guy. One of the people that really deeply influenced me. And one of the things he talks about, and this was a quote, he put it up on Facebook or something. It's like, Agile's an ordinary word in English. It means the ability to move quickly and easy with an emphasis on changing direction. And then remember, he was in the meeting where they did the Agile manifesto, and he said, so once they had that word in place, right? Or they basically had to figure out how it kind of applied to the processes of writing software. They came up with 4 values, 12 principles, and what he was making the point of is that that's what Agile was, okay? That's all Agile was, okay? And so those 4 principles in the manifesto are people and interactions over processes and tools, right? Agile is really about how people collaborate and how people interact rather than the methodology or the tools that we use to support that methodology. That was his first point. Second point, working software over comprehensive documentation. What the manifesto signers were trying to get across is that the only thing that matters when it comes to agility is, can we put an increment of the product in front of our customer and get feedback on it, right? Doing documentation doesn't get things in front of our customers so we can get feedback on it, right? That's not the actual product. So they were making this emphasis that intermediate artifacts are not a measure of progress. It's only if we can try to figure out how to get something in front of our customer and validate it. Third point, customer collaboration over contract negotiations. We want to really optimize for working together with our market, our product owners, our business, to make sure that we're continuously inspecting and adapting to be able to build the right product, okay? The last point was responding to change over following a plan. I hate to start off a talk on Agile around the idea of the manifesto. It's kind of passé. It's 18 years old or something at this point. But it's really important for our purposes. So when we think about how to apply Agile, right, we're not really thinking about Scrum per se. We don't want to think about the processes and mechanisms and ceremonies and roles and artifacts of Scrum. If we're going to think about doing Agile, we want to think about, how do we get people talking to each other? How do we start to measure progress in a real way? How do we want to opt for collaboration with our business stakeholders rather than managing through documents and sign-off? And how do we want to create delivery mechanisms and planning mechanisms that are adaptive to change? Does that make sense? Okay, so if we're talking about doing Agile and we're going to apply it outside of IT, we want to go back to those 4 major, kind of value systems. My microphone is like really super weird here. Can we take it down just a little bit from a heat perspective? Yeah, thanks. Awesome. Okay, so now we introduce the concept of Scrum. And we say, okay, how does Scrum relate to Agile? Well, if anybody goes back and listens to kind of the history of what was going on or reads about the history of what's going on, the methodologies kind of were invented first, right? So Scrum was out there, DSDM was out there, XP was out there, Crystal Clear was out there, feature-driven development. The lean guys had a seat at the table. And they got together in Snowbird, Utah and created that Agile manifesto we just went through. And so Scrum was one particular instantiation of the values and principles in Agile. So the kind of the methodologies were created first, and then the values and principles were derived from those particular methodologies. And so what we want to do is we want to look at, right, is Scrum now applicable? And what makes Scrum work? Because there's a lot of people in our industry right now that are going through the motions of doing the Scrum methodology without achieving the goals that were derived from that in the Agile Manifesto, okay? So if you think about, right, the Scrum Framework itself, right, what is it? It's 3 roles: product owner, Scrum Master, and team. So the product owner is the person who gets to decide what goes into the team's backlog. Right? The Scrum Master is kind of the facilitator, the enabler, the remover of impediments. And I do this whole big talk, and we've got a couple slides from that here in a minute. But a team in Agile is this group of 6 to 8 people that has everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver the value that's in the backlog. Okay? That's the context in which Scrum works. It's also ceremonies, right? So we have sprint planning, we have daily stand-up, we have reviews and retrospectives, right? Those ceremonies of Scrum are designed to operate in the context of a team that is operating off of a backlog so that they can produce a working test and increment of the product. The third piece, artifacts, product backlogs, sprint burn downs, right? Sprint backlogs, product increments, things like that. So what we're trying to do with Scrum is we're trying to take the backlog, we're trying to have a team swarm around the backlog and deliver a measurable increment of that at the end of every sprint. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so it's a methodology designed to help us value and get people talking to each other. It's a methodology designed to measure incremental progress rather than the measurement of deliverables done. It's a process to enable customer collaboration, and it's a process to be able to respond to change over following a plan. Okay? And so when you start talking about scaled frameworks, right, we've got SAFe. SAFe is basically, and to me, Scrum on steroids. Multiple teams, lots of dependencies, right? SAFe is a planning construct designed to kind of encapsulate the work that has to happen within a single value stream. Okay? So SAFe is just a different set of roles, a different set of ceremonies, a different set of artifacts designed to deliver against the values and principles of the Agile Manifesto, but at a larger level of scale. Okay? So large-scale Scrum, very similar. It requires more dedicated, encapsulated teams, not a lot of dependencies, right? That kind of a thing. Disciplined Agile delivery, my take on it, I don't know if Scott Ambler, the guy that invented it, would agree with me, but it's basically like a process enabler around progressive elaboration and discovery, largely based on, I think, work that he did with IBM and RUP, very focused on engineering disciplines, architecture, things like that, right? Very intentional about architecture up front. And then Nexus, that's kind of a new one. I don't really see it in the wild very often, and that's really about emergent process design and emergent kind of figuring things out as you go. So now if you're sitting here and you're running a food truck, or you're running a finance department, or you're running something else, right? Quantum mechanics, right? Research and development. Which of these processes are going to work for you? Right? I don't know, right? I don't know that any of them are. If I do Scrum, is that going to help me get things in market faster? Maybe, maybe not. If I'm trying to rebrand a hotel, what does that even mean? Okay, what is Scrum going to get me? Okay, I don't know that it's going to get you anything, right? So that's what we want to explore. The other thing that I want you guys to keep in mind as you consider figuring out how to apply Agile into these non-IT domains, the whole language around Agile, the whole patterns, the whole sets of frameworks and everything are really designed around these 3 things, right? And so when I'm talking to software organizations, I talk about these 3 things all the time, because if a software organization wants to adopt Agile, what they primarily have to commit to is that they're going to form teams that are going to be able to deliver against the backlog and to be able to produce a working tested increment at the end of the sprint. And so what is a backlog in Scrum? A backlog in Scrum is a list of very discrete things. So think of them as features or use cases or scenarios, things that actually deliver value into the product. And in software, because software is soft, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because I can add a feature, then layer another feature, layer another feature, layer another feature. I can have my testers test, I can have my business owners look at the product as it's emerging, and I can get feedback on it. Okay? It's very straightforward, not easy, but straightforward within a Agile kind of ecosystem to be able to build teams. A lot of times we'll ask particular clients to build teams around products or feature sets or business capabilities. Sometimes it's architectural components, right? Things like that. But again, a team, 6 to 8 people, has everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver the work that's in that backlog. At the end of a predetermined period of time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 week, couple days, something like that, right? We get into the idea of we can actually produce something of value that we can measure and inspect. So we can get to a definition of done. So I've built the feature, I've deployed it, I've put it in front of a customer, behavior on a website, something in a mobile app, different thing in an API, right? It's very quantifiable. It's very, I can measure it, I can assess progress, right? All that kind of stuff. So when I'm doing these kinds of talks for software organizations, that becomes the non-negotiable underpinnings of being able to do Agile. And then you layer on top of that whatever process framework, right? That becomes an enabler, a way of tracking progress and measuring and managing what you do. But the ultimate goal is to collaborate with your customers, be able to respond to change, value working tested product, right? And then value people and interactions, okay? So whatever we do in a non-IT context has to ultimately achieve those goals. But what I kind of wanted to do with you guys by going through these steps is get you to rethink whether just doing Scrum will solve the problem. I'm really kind of building an argument that in a lot of cases, especially when you're dealing with supply chains and lag time and latency and schedules and physical hardware having to get deployed or case goods having to get ordered, right? Just doing Scrum isn't going to achieve the goals. Does that resonate with you guys? That was kind of my experience, right? Because what I was seeing, my observations in the industry was that people were going through the motions of doing Scrum without actually achieving the business benefits that were described in the Agile Manifesto, okay? So the things that we want to look for, right, the benefits of agility that we would like are severalfold, right? We want clarity about what it is that we're looking to build. We want to be able to hold our teams accountable. We want to have really tight, measurable progress. We want to be able to give those teams local autonomy to decide, the ability to self-organize, the ability to have some agency to try to figure out what it is that they need to do, pushing decisions down to the right level within the organization. Right? We want them to be able to get to this definition of done, be able to demonstrate mastery, right? To make sure that they're not putting bad products out in the market, things people will use. We want to make sure that they're tied to the strategic objectives of the organization. We want transparency, we want trust, we want collaboration. A lot of the goals of Agile, a lot of times. The challenge that you're going to find, especially in large non-IT organizations where we're not building software, we're doing other things, right? Lots of Gantt charts and plans and things like that. You're going to find that it's tough to form the kinds of teams that you need to have in place to be able to do Agile. Backlogs are emergent. We don't necessarily know what it's going to take to be able to deliver this far enough in advance to be able to start to stabilize velocity and know the size of the work. Really difficult in some of these contexts to be able to deliver something of working tested value at the end of the sprint. Right? When I have to order a case good, wait 3 months for it to get shipped from China, look at it, put it in a hotel, see if somebody's going to use it, right? What we find is what does that even mean to do Agile in that context, okay? Non-Agile partners in your supply chain, right? That's really kind of an interesting thing even in software where, hey, I'm building software and it's Agile, but I'm working with somebody offshore who's doing waterfall. Or I have a partner or a component supplier that I'm trying to build or trying to work with that's doing waterfall. Wait, what do I do with that? External dependencies. Dependencies kill Agile even in software organizations. Dependencies are difficult to manage even in software teams and across software teams. Some of the dependencies that we see in non-IT contexts are just fascinating. Even in IT context, right? We build some software and then we have to wait for somebody on a client site to implement it to be able to get it in front of a client. Okay? And so dependencies are going to kill our ability to do Agile. And one of the things I like to say a lot is that we either have to figure out how to break dependencies or manage them. And these large non-IT projects, dependencies are very, very difficult to break. And then the last thing, which is probably the key, is that we really have to manage around is the idea of hard dates. Anybody have deadlines that they have to manage to? Seriously, only like 6 of you? Right? None of the rest of you guys have dates? It's not important? Well, so the interesting thing about dates, right, is if you listen to the keynote this morning, he had like a really interesting point that he tried to make, and towards the end of the talk, I kind of came in the second half, as he said, one of the things that's killing us is planning, right? There's no sense of like 12 to 13 to 18 months to 36 months. I mean, things are happening too fast and things are changing super fast. Well, that's true, I think, when we're talking at like the macro level. Right? We have to have some sort of strategy to be able to respond to that. But in the small, right, when we're trying to get work done, right, dates matter. If nothing else, dates matter if I've got 5 or 6 different work streams that all have to come together at a certain time. Right? I have to have some idea of when those different work streams are going to be done so that I can coordinate a marketing campaign, or I can coordinate having the truck there at the right time. Right? Interesting stuff, right? And so I just think there's a lot of thought and intentionality that we have to put into this if we're going to think about how to achieve some of the goals of Agile. We just can't mindlessly apply Scrum or apply SAFe or something like that. So we want to be very intentional about the kind of methodologies that we choose. So our challenge, right, and what we're going to try to get to in the last slide or two, is to create a system of delivery that allows us to use and to get some of the benefits of Agile while respecting the necessary constraints of the organization around us. Very seldomly are we in a position where we can dictate those constraints to external suppliers or even other parts within our own organization. Okay? So remember, we don't want to install Agile unless it helps us achieve agility. And quite often there's a real big difference between doing Scrum and actually achieving the goals in the Agile Manifesto. Okay? And so we want to make sure that we're achieving the goals of the Agile Manifesto with the methodologies that we're trying to leverage. And so the key insight for me, and this is going to be really super hard, and I apologize, these are not the best constructed slides ever. Maybe we can like read them together here. So let's see, I'm going to go to the edge, see if I can not fall off the stage. Schedules, milestones, and budgets establish constraints within which decisions and trade-offs are made. Top-level plans can be flow-based or schedule-based. So what do I mean? So I believe that it's possible to be agile within the context of constraints. Like, let's say, for example, let me see if I can anchor this into something really real. So we're in Austin, so I came from Atlanta late last night. Let's say I needed to be in Austin today to do this talk. Oh, another better example, I was in Denver earlier this week. So let's say I was going to drive to Denver, then drive to Austin. So getting to Denver on Tuesday for my talk is an absolute hard constraint. If I miss that, right, I don't get to do my talk, right? Conference organizers are mad at me. If I'm late to Austin, I don't get to stand here in front of you. So I want to be able to be agile, but I also know that I need to be in Denver in time for my talk, and I need to be in Austin in time for my talk, okay? The things that I don't know are, let's say if I chose to drive, right? I don't know if roads are going to be closed necessarily. I don't know if I'm going to run out of gas unexpectedly. I don't know if my car's going to break down. If I'm flying, I don't know if my flight's going to be delayed. I was on a late flight out last night. If that flight would have been late, I wouldn't have been here, right? That was the problem, right? So if we're going to try to be agile, but dates matter, what we want to do is we want to look at dates as a constraint that we want to try to manage to. We want to inspect and adapt, and we want to do Agile within that date constraint. Does that make sense? In Agile, a lot of times we tend to think, oh no, dates are bad, right? Responding to change over following a plan. Well, the interesting thing is that a lot of contexts require a plan. They require sync points. So our goal with Agile is to figure out how to inspect and adapt to optimize our chances of being where we need to be when we need to be there. That might seem trivial, but that is like a conceptual hurdle that I think a lot of people struggle with. Because when they read the Lean Startup books, they hear the keynote speaker earlier, right? There's this thought that we're just going to throw dates out the door. We're going to throw planning out the door, right? Planning is waste. And what I'm suggesting is that understanding those date constraints is actually really reasonable, even absolutely necessary. Maybe even to go one step further, if we don't have an answer for that question, we're not credible, okay? I had one client ask me a couple weeks ago, they said, how can we get our managers to stop asking us for dates? And I was like, really? You think they're ever gonna stop? Like getting done on a certain time is never, it's gonna stop being important, right? So the trick is, right? The trick is to create a system that enables us to effectively manage scope and to balance capacity and demand and to make trade-offs to be able to hit dates when we need to be there. Okay, so that's kind of a key concept. Prioritizing, sequencing, and validating decisions is the effort of a cross-functional collaborative team. Decisions are informed by the constraints, right? And then the point I want to try to make here is that a lot of times what we really find is that it's the decision-making that needs to be agile, not as much the execution. Okay, so if I've got, so I go back to the hotel chain example that we're going to go through, and their big problem was that you had the people that were designing the case goods, the people that were orchestrating the physical moves of stuff into the hotels, the order in which the hotels were going to go in, the colors, the installation of the tile, the installation of the materials, the installation of the signs on the front, right? Those things were not going to happen in an agile way, right? They're being done by outside suppliers. What their struggle was how to prioritize decisions so that they could get the right people working on the right things at the right time. And the key insight for me, remember I said I'm exploring this idea with you guys, the key insight for me is that they didn't need Scrum at the execution level. They didn't need sprint planning and daily stand-ups and reviews and retrospectives and Scrum Masters and things like that. What they needed was to get the right 7 or 8 people in a room and get the decision-making process flowing. Okay, so I'll explain this in a little bit more visually. But the interesting thing is that the actual work that was being done in kind of a Scrum, kind of Kanban kind of way was decision-making. That's a fascinating insight to me, right? It wasn't that we needed to execute in an agile way. We needed to make decisions in an agile way. We needed to make decisions collaboratively and in small batches. And we needed to get decisions out to the execution teams in small batches. We didn't necessarily need the truck drivers to use a Scrum board. Okay, you guys follow me? Okay. And then execution can be managed using agile, iterative and incremental, plan-driven, waterfall, right, whatever. Deliverables are measured and assessed against near-term milestones. So think about this. You've got dates that are operating as a set of constraints. You're using Agile to break down work collaboratively and feed that work to the teams. You can use a lot of really out-of-the-box Agile stuff kind of in that next layer. And then underneath that, right, it doesn't really matter how things execute, but we need to be able to measure what's being able to get done and then create a feedback loop. Right? So if we have constraints, we're getting the flow of decision making right. These people are executing down here, right? As they execute, feedback goes up and we can make trade-offs to make sure we're understanding how we're operating within the constraints. Okay? So those were kind of my key insights. Because again, right, we're sitting here going, I'm an Agile consultant. I want to help these folks achieve greater agility. Don't think Scrum's going to do that with the truck driving team. Okay, and so what are we going to do, right? So again, right, striving for agility. So feedback loops link the various levels of planning and provide feedback against portfolio objectives. How are we doing on time? We're doing pretty good. Make sense, kind of? Okay, there's a lot of setup in this talk, right? So let's talk a little bit about the models and right, how it kind of played out. So the key pattern that I think is generally applicable here is the idea that you have a multi-tier kind of program portfolio management system. You have constraints at the top that govern the work, right? So we have to have some sort of boundary conditions to make sure that all of the different activities underneath that are going on, we understand where they're going to be in time or where they need to be in time to be successful. There's an interesting, this is just kind of an aside, not really a point that I had intended to make, but one of the things that I observed that's really interesting is that, we have a real big aversion to estimates in the Agile community. And the problem is that we have imperfect information about what needs to be built, or when, or how things, what it's going to take to actually do things. And so we give an estimate, and that estimate, basically is used to create a staffing plan, and it's used to create a schedule. And then we kind of like fix all the stuff around it, right? So what happens is that when we provide an estimate, it actually becomes a budget or a constraint, and then we're held accountable for it when we didn't really have enough information to actually make the estimate to begin with. And so kind of grown-up project management, grown-up program and portfolio management is, in effect, the managing of risk to make sure that we're delivering the most possible value within the constraints we've established. When we're dealing with imperfect information, our only option is to make sure that we're measuring progress and communicating out how we're making progress against that constraint. Okay? I think that's the only grown-up way to do this. And most of these projects are going to have constraints. So constraints are at the top layer. The middle tier is how we make decisions and trade-offs. Okay, so we want to bring all of the right people together to make sure that we're taking those constraints and we're collaborating to make sure that we're varying scope, varying implementation, making the right trade-offs so that we can optimize our chances of being able to deliver within the constraints. And then last but not least, there's an execution layer that's the actual doing of the work. So you think about it, right? The work is being fed with all the right decisions. The marching orders are absolutely, dead on. Somebody hits a pothole, flat tire, truck breaks down, any number of things could go wrong, right? That's gonna happen. We're gonna take that reality that's happening, and we're going to feed that back in and allow that decision-making layer to make the right trade-offs, communicate up to the constraints layer, right? So that's the general pattern. Constraints, decision-making, and execution. Okay? So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to walk through like two really specific examples. This is like real life stuff that we did kind of following this pattern, and it's working. Okay? So it's just kind of interesting. So the first one, kind of the case study, right? The better sleep side of my better sleep, faster food talk. Hotel chain, going through major rebranding, right? Somebody you've heard of. And this was roughly the model that we put in for them. And the idea was, and so what I'm trying to represent is that top layer is the set of constraints. And so there were 7, 15, something like that, different work streams, but I think what I put up here was like the property schedule, when the different properties had signed up to be able to go live with the new branding. Had a really interesting, I have a friend who runs a Chick-fil-A, and they were going through a similar type of branding effort in Atlanta. And what was fascinating, you think about like constraints, right? They're like every Chick-fil-A is really like a small business. It's really owner operated. They have a profit sharing model with Chick-fil-A. It's a really fascinating business model, the way that Chick-fil-A franchises. And the challenge that they had is that they needed to be able to get their rebranding or their rebuild of their restaurant done by the end of the year. Because this is a family, right? Kids play lacrosse with my kids, right? All this stuff. And so they were saving money over a period of time to be able to keep their employees paid during the holiday. Okay, so they needed to get this done during kind of when there was downtime and stuff like that. The interesting challenge was if the rebrand was delayed, then that money they saved they would have had to pay taxes on it in this calendar year. Then they would have had to save more money in the next calendar year to be able to keep their employees paid. So like a really, really hard constraint. Okay? So in this particular case, the property owners of these different hotel properties had a say in when they were going to absorb this cost. Okay, so that was a very real sequencing constraint. And it wasn't like, hey, we know we're 3 weeks late, so we're just going to show up 3 weeks later, right? Real money, real dollars, real people's lives involved. So the property owners got a thing, right? The people that were running it got a view. There was a view through case goods, right? We had to decide what to order, like not only like, what trundle bed was going to go into the room, or what couch, or what phone, or what desk, right? What tile, what carpet, so there was a whole process of deciding what needed to be figured out, how we would get stuff back from the supplier in China, how we would get that to the hotel, and how we would validate that it actually fit and was the right thing in the room, right? That was a really fascinating line. And then marketing was another one of the major tracks, right? How were we going to position this, and collateral and all the different things that were around it, okay? Fascinating. So what we ended up with was a set of, like I said, 10, 15 different work streams that all had to be synchronized in order to be able to get these hotels rebranded at the right schedule, because those were hard dates, okay? Their challenge is that they didn't have a way of making decisions collaboratively that optimized their chances of being successful. So you had an architecture group that wanted to kind of think through the whole thing. You had the case goods group that wanted to think through the whole thing. You had the marketing team that wanted to think through the whole thing. So you say, well, like, what is agility in that context? And so what I'm trying to do with that top indicator is we took all of the different constraints, right, all the different things that had to happen, and literally drew a line through it. And we said, okay, if we're going to hit this set of things by the end of the summer, what decisions do we absolutely have to make today in order to be able to hit that date? What decisions can we defer to later? And one of the things that we kind of had in our favor, which was pretty cool, is that the hotel owner operators that had agreed to go earlier were willing to take more risk and maybe even absorb some rework to be able to get the rebranding done earlier. So what we were doing is we basically said, okay, the stuff that's going to get delivered early is going to be less than perfect. The stuff that we deliver in the middle is going to be more right and probably require less rework. And the stuff towards the end should be really pretty solid. So what we did is we used those constraints to basically create a decision queue. Okay? So at any given moment, we knew what was the next most important sets of decisions to be able to deliver against. And then we used those to feed a team. And this was literally a team, 7 to 8 people, sitting in a room, kind of war room, classic Agile style, with all of the sticky notes up on the board, Kanban boards, right? All that kind of stuff. That's how that middle tier was implemented. So some of the other examples in the room, right? Let's say I am a software team, but I've got to interface with legal. I've got to interface with finance. I've got to interface with my marketing team. I've got to interface with my sales team. I've got to interface with my support team, my field people, right? So what you can do is you can say, okay, here's all of the different tracks that have to be lined up together. Very Gantt charty, very waterfall-ish, right? All that kind of stuff. Right? But we're grown-ups, project managers, right? So we know that we have to manage. That just doesn't come for free. So you progressively elaborate that backlog based upon the sets of things that are coming up and the things that have to be decided. And again, the key for this particular group was that those sets of decisions would form the decision backlog. That cross-functional team would collaborate and make those decisions and manage trade-offs within constraints, optimize their chances of being successful getting into that hotel at the time. And then as they made those key decisions, they would go and they would farm out the work in their respective areas, and they would get a certain set of case goods ordered. They get a certain set of tile ordered. They get a certain set of branding materials ordered. They do the site work for the hotels as they were coming up. So we didn't care so much how the activities were getting done, but we did care that we were feeding the execution layer activities in smaller batches, right? So they could do a little bit of work, 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 okay? If anything down at the lowest level was running late, right, which is going to happen, then that would inform the decision-making layer. The decision-making layer would try to make trade-offs within the constraints to try to manage and mitigate the concern. And then if they couldn't, then they would go up to the top and adjust the schedule. Okay? Now let's see if that passes the test, right? So it didn't pass the Scrum test, I guarantee. It's not going to pass the safe or large-scale Scrum test, okay? But does it help us, kind of respect people and interaction side of things over processes and tools? Okay? Well, we're collaborating in the middle. We collaborated on the top. We worked in small batches with our execution layer. We got feedback as to what was really happening. We're talking up and down the stack, and everybody's being real about the schedule. I think people and interactions probably passes, right? Working tested software over comprehensive documentation. Were we getting things in market so we could get feedback on them, or were we getting caught up in decision-making paralysis? Well, I would suggest that we were making decisions progressively, getting those decisions out to our various groups, and we were able to get hotels delivered, which was their unit of value, without having to wait for everything to be designed and figured out. Responding to change over following a plan, right? Because we were planning in small batches, we were able to adjust as we got feedback coming up. What's the last one? Working software over comprehensive documentation. I think I blended some of my principles, I apologize. But you get the idea, right? So I think if you go back to the manifesto, then you can kind of go, I think we achieved a lot of the value in the Agile Manifesto from doing it this way. Again, we used elements of Scrum, we used elements of Waterfall, we used elements of Kanban, we used elements of just good project management, risk management, communications planning, right? All that kind of stuff. And we achieved agility without being dogmatic about whether we use Scrum or not. Okay, makes sense? Okay, so I think the pattern holds, right? So this was the first one that we did like this. The second one that we did, so we're supposed to stop at about 10 till, so we got about 10, 15 minutes left, something like that. I'm going through a little bit quick because we're trying to recover the 10 minutes that we lost at the beginning. Try to keep everybody else on track here today. The next one that we did was around, it was a fast food chain. And this one was really fascinating. And they had spent 10 years with a particular product in development. And their challenge is that they were trying to figure out how to shorten their product development lifecycle. Okay? Really fascinating. Okay? So the interesting thing is that when the product's success criteria is totally defined by the owner as to whether something tastes good enough or not, right? That's a fascinating thing, right? Because it's like, how long does it take to get the next iteration of your cheeseburger good enough? Like, what's good enough, right? So they had spent 10 years on this one particular product. They were spending a lot of other time around like trying to figure out how to get more kitchen equipment into their kitchens. And they were convinced, though, that when they changed the fundamental structure of the fryer, that it made the fries taste different. Right? And if your brand is around your food, right? I mean, the fries can't taste different, right? They have to taste like they've tasted for the last 50 years. So how do you optimize the fryer footprint so that you can make a French fry that tastes exactly the same way that it tasted yesterday? Like, what does that even look like, right? How do you put a backlog together around that? How do you do Scrum around that? How do you get to a definition of done around that? And so the realization in this particular client was that the constraint layer at the top wasn't like a set of hard things that had to be delivered against. What the constraint layer in this particular client was a set of decisions that had to be made, getting back to that decision stuff, a set of investments, a set of validated hypotheses. Right, so if you go to like the Stanford design thinking thing, you go to lean startup thinking, you start to kind of put your head in that space. We're going to create a hypothesis that we can create a brand new cheeseburger in 3 months. Okay, so we run an experiment to create that cheeseburger, and then we test to see if we created an acceptable cheeseburger. If we created an acceptable cheeseburger, maybe we go into production with it. If we didn't create an acceptable cheeseburger, we have to decide, do we want to invest another 3 months to get to a better iteration of the cheeseburger? So at every experiment, right, at every planning horizon, you have a redo, kill, go, no go, right, that kind of stuff. And so that's what we were trying to figure out in that top layer, is like, what is the workflow? Like all the way from ideate to prototype. I can't even see what's up on my screen here, but you get the idea, right? So you're going through those different phases. And what we were trying to do with that little crazy loop up at the top is that when you got down to one of those last steps, we said, okay, did our experiment pay off? If it paid off, then go into production. If our hypothesis about how to build this cheeseburger was wrong, we can decide to go back to an earlier step and redo it and get more funding. Or if we've invested enough and we want to abandon the idea, we could kill it. Does that make sense? Okay? So where the first example was basically trying to operate within a very fixed set of constraints, what we were trying to do in this particular example was trying to manage extreme variation. Now the interesting thing though is that the people doing the work were engineers working on fryers, industrial engineers working on the layout of the drive-through line to make sure that they were getting people through the lines as fast as they possibly could, creating new product ideas, right? Things that don't lend themselves to doing Scrum. Okay, so what we did in this particular case is we put a value stream up at the top that was very lean startup, very design thinking, and it was all about creating hypotheses, doing the work to validate the hypotheses, evaluating whether we got the right payoff or not, and then deciding whether to go to market. So that was the top layer. That was the set of constraints. The set of constraints wasn't dates and timelines. It was how much money are we willing to invest to keep trying this. It's a different mental model, okay? And then so what they would do is that, so when they decided to invest in the next increment of trying to figure out how to do the fryer, then they would say, okay, well, we got funding for another 3 months to try. What's our hypothesis on what we want to try? We're going to take this direction, that direction, the other direction. Once they have that hypothesis, now they can start breaking down the work. They can start engaging the prototype team. They can start to engage the test kitchen team. They can start to engage their local restaurant operators. They can start to engage customers to do beta testing and things like that, right? Blind taste tests, right? All those kinds of things. It's not really agile. That's not really agile teams. Right? That's going to happen when it happens, but they could break down the work, right? Make all the necessary decisions about what was the right way to proceed over the next month or two, get that work organized into small batches, and start to feed work into the teams that were actually going through and doing all that other kind of stuff. And then just like in the previous example, the teams at the lower level would execute, do the work, and then feed back into the decision-making cycle. So the decision makers could decide how to inspect and adapt. And then that would go back up into, hey, did it work, did it not work? And then at that next stage gate, they'd make a go, no-go decision about how to proceed. Okay? I would suggest that this probably passes our Agile Manifesto litmus test as well, without explicitly doing Scrum. One pattern that you might see, has everybody heard of a methodology called Kanban? Okay, David Anderson was the guy who coined that. He wrote a great book back in 2002, 2003 called Agile Management for Software, something like that. That's a paraphrase of the title. And what he was basically doing is he was applying a kind of a lean theory of constraints model to the sequencing of software work. As if anybody's ever read Eli Goldrat's The Goal or has a background in industrial and systems engineering, really anchored in that kind of school of thought, very manufacturing oriented. And he was applying those same kind of like assembly line, Toyota just-in-time principles into, in effect, the manufacturer of software. And it was very influential for me back in 2002, 2003 when I read it. And then he kind of codified that into the Kanban method for software. And so Kanban is oftentimes a way of increasing agility without necessarily going through the overhead associated with forming teams, backlogs, working tested software, right? It's just a different take on doing that. And so what we find a lot when we want to increase agility in organizations that are not necessarily wired for it, and this pattern almost always holds, is that there's some sort of decision-making group in the middle that's basically breaking decisions into small batches, collaborating, and moving those decisions through to execution as fast as we can. And again, I mean, it would be an interesting exercise, right? To go through and say, okay, what would be a context of mixed methodology IT things where we could basically break the work into a decision queue? And how much better off would we be if we could get collaborative decision making and then feeding just-in-time decisions down to the execution teams? I probably wouldn't care all that much what the execution teams are actually doing to manage their stuff. And then again, depending upon the constraints, you either subordinate that to a traditional kind of project plan, or if it's more experimental, to a lean startup, design thinking kind of, we're gonna make a bet, we're gonna validate the investment, see if we wanna decide to keep on going. So that's kind of my hypothesis. What do you guys think? Any thoughts, questions? Way in the back? No? Okay, yes. Quantum mechanics, quantum physics or something? Yeah, just kidding. Yeah.
One of the things that you said was clients expecting, oh, Agile is going to solve our problem.
Yeah.
No, Agile is not going to solve your problem anymore than your physical therapist will solve your problem. He will help you, but you still have to do the work.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is there's a kind of a, it's not even a joke. It's almost like a, I don't know, it's just a thing we say in Scrum, right? Scrum doesn't fix your problems. Scrum just shows you your problems, but you have to turn around and fix them. And so there's a lot of organizations, even software-wise, where they start to do Scrum and they realize they don't have teams formed the right way, or they realize they can't get backlog, or they realize they don't have good strategy, or they realize they don't have dependencies. And so what we see is we see a lot of people failing with Agile because they can't actually remove the impediments that they're encountering by deploying it.
That's another problem.
Yeah.
A lot of people equate Agile with Scrum.
Yeah.
Say you run a help desk.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be Agile. I'll implement Scrum.
Yeah.
So somebody calls and says, hey, I just lost access to all the Unix systems. Oh, open a ticket. We have the next Scrum planning in 2 weeks. The next Scrum's probably going to be pretty full. You're looking at the one after that. So about 6 weeks.
Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to hop over that step, right? That's not a healthy step to be in, right? So the mental model I want you guys to have isn't, when you talk about applying Agile in these cases, is we're going to go start doing Scrum. What we want to do is we want to go back to the original manifesto. We want to look at those values and principles that we are trying to achieve. And then there is a rich set of methodology and understanding that we can draw from and design. We can design systems of delivery that enable agility in a lot of different contexts, not just software, okay? And what I would suggest is that one of the things that we're struggling with, and this is kind of a drum I beat all the time, is the blind application of process to contexts and domains that are not applicable to it. And that's where most people are getting in trouble. But by combining lean, theory of constraints, Kanban, flow-based systems, Scrum, right, design thinking, lean startup, and waterfall and plan-driven, you can create methodologies. But I really do think this pattern of constraints, collaborative decision-making in small batches, feeding execution queues, is a pretty interesting design pattern that enables us to marry a lot of different disciplines that aren't necessarily cut out for doing Scrum. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, no, it's more of like a statement and also speaking to what you said about mitigating risk and also making those decisions. And what he said, you should be leaving stuff in your sprint enough for like bugs, which in that case, the Unix goes down. That's technically a bug, and it's something you have to go to real time. So it's not just something that you'd be like, oh, let's put it in our backlog. No, that's technically a bug. The system is having issues. That, you know, we deployed it. We have to go back and fix it. So that's also a risk, and you're having to communicate.
So no way I could repeat that question for the audience. But you know, one of the things where I think software went wrong, and I think it's because software is a relatively new industry, is that we started putting activities in Gantt charts rather than outcomes in Gantt charts. If you go back into the PMBOK and the early project management stuff or current project management stuff, there's this notional idea of like a work package, right? The units in a project plan are supposed to be something of measurable value that's worth paying for. And where that's kind of translated to over the years is that most of the software delivery Gantt charts that I see are all activity-based and non-value add work. Right? You could literally take an Agile software project and turn it into a Gantt chart based on releases, sprints, intermediate deliverables, right? All that kind of stuff. And then you could measure, right? So really, like what I'm really saying is that you could build a function-based Gantt chart, iterate against what are the decisions that need to be made to feed the backlog, and then the teams could operate in Scrum, and you could do that totally within the context of a project plan. If you have the right stuff in the project plan. We can run whole enterprise transformations in effect in a Gantt chart, right? It sounds kind of crazy, right? As Agilists, we go, oh, we don't want no stinking project plan, but it's like I'm telling you, when you're spending other people's money and it's serious business, you've got to be able to commit the dates. And so saying that we're not going to commit the dates or we're not going to commit the budgets is mostly a non-starter. Okay, there's going to be incredibly disruptive things that we're going to see happen, and I get it, right? Companies are going to want to do R&D, and they're going to lift some of those things and for some of their work, but for a lot of the operational stuff, dates matter, right? So we have to shift the conversation and talk about how to manage dates.